Welcome to LoTech Tuesdays by LoTech Wild, the podcast for those who live their life unplugged and for those who want to. LoTech Wild is a podcast brought to you by Valdez Adventure Alliance in Valdez, Alaska. We have guests that we learn from all around the world, and we invite anyone who is interested to come and visit the beauty of Valdez, Alaska.
Hello.
Awesome.
Let's see if this works.
Different lighting, but I think we're good to go. Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome to the podcast, Cortney Sanders.
Thank you. Thanks.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. Yeah.
So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you. We met, just as a little background for anyone listening, we met because I'm teaching you how to ride a bicycle. And so bicycles are kind of my thing. You know, these days I've been, I have a long history with cycling at this point in my life. And so I'm really excited to be a League certified instructor through the League of American Bicyclists. And then somehow we connected, and I really feel like we had a real connection. Like you're amazing. And so, I want to get to know you better. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely do think that we had a strong connection as I was falling every other time I got on the bike. But, I come from Houston, Texas. I was born and raised there, and I've traveled all over since, I started school basically. So I come from a very huge family, and most of my family stayed in Houston, and I was just kind of like this oddball who was like, I want to go, I want to explore, let's go somewhere different, let's do something different. So about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I went to the University of Texas at Austin to start my undergraduate college career. And then there I studied abroad. So I had a travel bug. And then I did my master's in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it's extremely cold. And I think we bonded about that because you do this great work in the cold in the wintertime. And I was like, oh my God, I remember these snow days in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
And then
you visited Alaska before, haven't you?
No, I haven't, but it's on my list.
Okay, well, you got to come up for the fat bike bash then.
Exactly, right? Well, because of you, I might actually be able to participate a little bit in learning to ride the bike, right? And so I think the most current part is I'm a researcher at a think tank in Washington, D.C. And so I lived there for about 5 years. Cool. And I just moved back to Austin in May. And I was on vacation with a group of people, and we were in Montana, and they were saying, oh, we can go bike riding. And I was like, well, I actually don't know how to ride a bike. And, this person thought that they were going to get a dig, in or insult me, but it really became a fuel to a fire when they were like, oh, you're too old not to learn how to ride a bike and all these different things. And so I was like, that could have hurt my feelings, but instead, I'm actually going to try to do something about this because that sounds like a great idea. And that's how we got connected. And we've been doing this work together ever since.
Yes. And you're doing fantastic also. And I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of courage, I think, to start something new as an adult, because when you're little, you're low to the ground. It seems like little children just bounce, when they fall, they just get right back up again. And when you're, an adult, it's like, and like trauma, and then it's like, but that hasn't been happening. I mean, if you kind of lean one side, you catch yourself, and then you pick yourself up and you do it again, So yeah, you're doing great. It's wonderful. And so welcome back to Austin, Texas, by the way.
Thank you.
It is a very big cycling community, and you don't have a car currently, is that correct?
That's correct. And I don't know how to drive. I'm actually learning how to drive, in my adulthood as well. And it's also really scary, but I think because I started learning to ride the bike with you, I felt a little bit more confident about getting behind the wheel. So it definitely is a whole new vibe going on over here.
I love it. And it's just amazing that, so you went through all of college and got your master's degree. And then it's like, these things are secondary. You are like, oh, well, this is less important. It's really more important for me to focus on this, this incredible academia, really. I mean, and then the work in policy that you are participating in and doing right now. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So where I sit in the organization, we have a federal team and a state team, and I sit on our state team, and we focus specifically on how states across the entire nation, including our territories, raise money or revenue and how they spend it. And when you break it down, we really just focus a lot on taxes, right? Because you use taxes, which is how states or governments typically raise money or revenue, and how they spend it, which is the budget side. So I like to say, I'm a tax and budget researcher because those are the things that I do. But what makes me so unique and a huge contribution to my organization and the entire economic and policy field and network is that I spend an intentional time looking at things through a racial equity lens, looking at things through a gender equity lens, making sure that we understand that even something as like rudimentary as taxes or budget policy is not race neutral. There is bias there. There's a long history there. And I try to help my colleagues and people across the world actually dig into that a little bit more and flesh that out so that when we see these outcomes that are inequitable, right? When we see outcomes of disparities in income or in work, or how, one neighborhood gets this school and another neighborhood gets that school, we start to realize that even though a policy might look on the book race neutral, or might look like, oh yeah, money goes here, money goes there, it really has deep outcomes that really can impact someone's life and path. And so what I do is I help those crunch the numbers, interpret those numbers, give it to people who want to advocate with lawmakers, or help people write better policy and make sure that these outcomes are actually helping everybody, no matter where they live, no matter where they're born or how they look.
That's fantastic. Those sound like some really difficult conversations to have sometimes. How do you manage the emotional side of that?
That's a great question. I think, two things are at play. A lot of times people don't bring their full self to work. So they feel like they can just kind of cut that off, and they don't have to deal with those difficult conversations in the lens of, I'm not going to take it personal because this is just work and things like that. But I oftentimes encourage people to bring their full selves, which means sometimes it can get a little bit emotional. Sometimes it can be difficult to hear something that you just hadn't thought of before. I'll tell you this. I asked my team and a lot of people that I work with, do you really want to be an expert in your field? And if you don't talk about these issues, you actually are not doing a good job in the field that you want to be an expert in. And I think once we kind of pare that back a little bit, these conversations, we know race is an emotional topic in the US, especially right now, but it always have been for centuries. We know that when we start talking about white supremacy or privilege or bias and all these things, a lot of emotions are raised, a lot of trauma is put to the forefront. But at the same time, we also know that we want the world to be a better place. Right. And I think when we get to the why we are having these difficult conversations, or the purpose or the North Star where we want to go to, people realize like, okay, it's not that hard. Like, because we all we want to hone in our shared values, right? Like people want to be in a room, in a space, in work where our shared values matter more than the scary part of the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How did you decide that this was something that you wanted to pursue? Like, when did you know? Like, I mean, it's such a weird, specific thing. I mean, I can see like, you're like, okay, policy, but then just the fact that you're working in the budgetary side of it across the nation is very specific.
Very niche is what we like to say. Not sexy, but definitely important. Wow, that's such a funny and interesting question. I think, well, I'll say this. I never thought in a million years I would be doing this. In fact, before I got my master's, I thought I was going to go into higher education policy, which focused specifically on how do we get little boys, little girls, and other young people from neighborhoods that had not the best education into schools that were going to give them the best education in college, and that those colleges would do right by them by being diverse and things like that. So that's when I went to get my master's. I went to the Ford School with that in mind, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to learn economics. I'm going to learn these things. But I was in an economics course, and this professor just like kind of brushed over things like, we would talk about the housing market and economics. That is like economics 101, right? The Great Recession, 2008, the boom, right? The bubble burst. And not one time did we really intentionally talk about redlining, which is an historic moment where the government intentionally decided to segregate Black and white families and have disproportionate like outcomes for where people lived within the country. And you see that a lot when you think about Chicago and Detroit and these Midwest North places. And that just kind of like triggered me a little bit. And then we started talking about healthcare and Obamacare, and we didn't talk about gender equity and how if Obamacare or the American Affordable Cares Act, ACA, if it now has mandated federally that women, men, whoever who are working now gets insurance by their employer by mandate, then what does that mean for job discrimination? When a woman is maybe pregnant or potentially wants to be pregnant and create a family, and they're sharing that information, and they use that against her in the hiring process because they don't want to pay more in health insurance compared to some other candidate, like a man, for example, who might not be potentially 9 months pregnant. And so these were things that my economics teacher just was like not talking about. And I was at this policy school, and I told myself, I care about this one issue, but I understand that it's economists who are creating policy alongside policymakers and government officials. So I immediately like switched up my entire course load from education to economics, public finance, and social policy immediately that next semester. And I finished my entire graduate career doing just that: poverty alleviation, public finance, and budgeting work. And that's how I got into this big world of nicheness. I did this fellowship right after after my master's degree at the current organization that I'm at, and I've just been there ever since.
Gotcha. Yeah. So money is a hard thing to argue with. Like if somebody is, when you're just looking at the numbers don't necessarily reflect the humanity that's behind the numbers. And so, I think that is, that's a very interesting twist. And you just made like a 180-degree turn, right? That must have been slightly scary also.
Oh, wow. Scary is not the word. And also too, what's interesting about the journey that I decided to take is being the only one or very few that look like you in this space, in this journey, also was something that was nerve-wracking at the time. Not anymore. I'm confident in my work. I'm confident in my field. But I think anybody who's trying something new, whether that's learning how to ride a bike or going into tax and budget policy, when you don't see people who look like you, or when you don't have that many people in your network, whether that's your family or your friend group who's doing what you do, you ask yourself, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Am I doing the right thing? Would this even matter? Is this my purpose? All the questions, right? But over time, you realize that something in your gut told you to take this path and this journey. And if you trust that, and kind of just do away with everything else in the world, you'll understand how important it is to just keep going. Yeah.
Yes. Because you're really taking what has historically been one-dimensional information and making it 3D. You're bringing it to life. And that must be a lot of notes. You got a lot of notes, right? Because I mean, I run spreadsheets all the time, and and then I'm thinking about all the asterisks by all of the different numbers, like what does this population, I've got like 25 million on the board here, asterisks, and then you have to like expand that. Well, that's 25% this or 50% that or 30% this. I mean, it's really the way that we need to be looking at all of the data,
Absolutely. And I love what you're talking about, because it's still not perfect. Even I trip up on this work. I have people ask me all the time, why is there asterisks next to Asian when we're disaggregating data by race? And the reality is that we don't have all the tools yet to really paint a broad picture, but that's not an excuse, because what we do is we create indivisible communities. We create kind of like this collage of a gray unknown when we do that, which people, mission-driven organizations will say, oh, we are here to help people, all types of people who have these issues. And then we put asterisks, to your point, right, to all these numbers, to all these things. And we kind of just do away with it. And my push is like, okay, if we don't have the numbers, how can we talk about this? How can we break this down in a way that is inclusive? That when we look at taxes or budgets and the numbers, because if math is math and math is real, how are we really showing how it is real with the human impact in mind, with the people in mind?
And it's very dynamic. In my seemingly long history of being an ancient person over here, I have encountered women, for example, who have asked me, as I'm leading an organization, if I conferred with the men and gotten their permission. And so it's like I'm hearing from what I would say would be one of my own, right? If I'm doing exactly the opposite of what I want to be doing, what ultimately I'm trying to free myself from as a female, So, you combat these things, and it's very dynamic. It's a very much a work in progress. And then also, like, even when you say Asian, I belong to the Chicago Asian Council at some point. I was the only person, I'm only half Japanese, but I was the only one representing Japan there, which was strange. There's a gigantic Japanese community, by the way, in Chicago, just side note. They could have been represented, but these people don't all get along. Right. I mean, it was like all of these different representations of different cultural backgrounds. And really, I felt like it was an advantage to be really more American, because I could see it more clearly, where they were still coming purely from their own cultural point of view. They had a hard time because it was so personal. Like if you were to say, something about the Philippines, it would be very much a personal attack, where like, if someone would say something about Japan, well, I'm seeing it as a half Japanese person, but I'm seeing it also from afar. You know what I mean? So there's a little bit more objectivity. But yeah, people don't like each other, Well,
I mean, it's kind of like you get 13 years in America. I should preface, you get 13 years of education to learn everything more or less about white people. And then every now and again, a triumph here and there for Black people, right? Like for me growing up, it was slavery. In Texas, it was farmers, right? But slavery, Martin Luther King, Obama, right? And so there wasn't this cultural diversity of just what a whole life looks like from just an African-American perspective, let alone a Japanese or Chinese American. We know what happened in California. We know what happened during World War I. Right. We know what happened during World War II. We know all these things. We know what happened to Native communities, that land that we're still on right now, and how we stripped that away from them. We as in Americans were folks that first colonized this land. And so but we had 13 years of education and no one is getting that. And so of course, difference is scary. That's the first thing we talked about today. When something is different, it's feeling uncomfortable, it's feeling scary. And so a lot of times, while it's not an excuse, the natural response is to have defense, right? And denial, and to kind of rub up against those that may even look like you, right? Like, because especially in Asian communities, because of these different nature of cultural passes rubbed against each other, and we haven't had these conversations, right? And when we have had them, they have been at the kitchen table and not in spaces where we can have, I don't want to say public discourse, but like have these frank and open Socratic conversations with each other that is protected and safe and guarded in a way of sacrecy. And so as a result of that, when you get in a community, right, you're volunteering and you're like, whoa, I didn't know this was a thing. But that's the reality we live in.
Yeah. And so I guess where we all kind of where we can come together, is seeing that there are places that we can come together. Mm-hmm. So as an Asian American, I'm a very tiny minority. Like as a Japanese American, I'm a very tiny minority. As an Asian American, I'm in a bigger group of people, mm-hmm. So, but yeah, I imagine that, especially, so it's hard too, because being a female also, so there's being a minority, and there's being a female minority, and there's patriarchy all around the globe. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to be, the dominant ruler, and it's a challenge to overcome that, because I do think that because women have children, and I'm speaking personally here because I only know what's going on inside of my own head, right? I think, I am definitely a nurturer, and so I have that. And I think that, my ex-husband was a nurturer also, but it was definitely different. And where I left my whole job, and like I was, got hired by a public accounting firm right out of college. And I left that whole thing to work at home because of an array of reasons. I mean, childcare is A, expensive, but B, it's really dirty, mm-hmm. And so we have to make these choices. And I think, it's how do the numbers reflect something like that can be a real philosophical conversation,
Absolutely. I think that you're so spot on, right? Like, think about the moment we're in. We've been in COVID for about 2 years now. We see how the unemployment rate has risen at all times high. And we also have seen it come down through stimulus, through federal relief from the federal government, through loans to businesses, to unemployment insurance for families who were laid off due to COVID-19. We've seen all types of things happening. But the reality is that during the past 2 years, and honestly, before then, it was women who were having the largest job losses than any other group. And then when you start to break that down by race, Black women, and then you start seeing this huge gap in between who's really recovering and who isn't. And so it's so funny when I hear that word recovery, when we think about COVID-19 and how we want to get back to whatever we were in. I honestly believe we should not go back to normal, mm-hmm. because what you're saying is that normal is women going back into this nurturing phase, right? Going back into this patriarchal mindset, but system that says, oh, when these things happen, you should stop working, or you should take on this role, and this other person takes on that role. But more importantly, from a numbers perspective, as the economy is starting to do somewhat better, and as inflation is rising, there's something else happening in the background. The unemployment rate for Black people is still at an all-time high. And even though it is on average decreasing, we see that those who are in low-wage work, no matter their race or gender, but most of the time we know women are in low-wage work, in leisure and hospitality work, they are not faring as well as we have hoped for them. And then to bring in a larger perspective, why is it that in an economy that we're in, and we know how vital childcare is, we actually have Build Back Better. One of the biggest things in Build Back Better is an incentive for states to re-up their childcare and have like a huge investment. Billions of dollars are going to be invested in that. If states, take up that, it's an incentive situation there. But in this economy, we don't have an infrastructure for childcare, a one in which that is sustainable, that's healthy, and that will make sure that our early age kids will thrive and live up to their fullest and highest potential. And so then women or families are at a crossroads. Do I even send my person to this childcare place? Do I do it myself? Can I even afford it? Right? Because the ones that are all those things that we imagine, we hope for, are sometimes a third, if not more, of someone's entire annual income, right? The money that they make all year, a third of it could go to childcare for one kid, not even multiple kids. And so I really love your story. And I really love that, because that is kind of like the work that I get to do when I'm breaking down the taxes and the budget side of things. It's like, okay, we're not raising enough money. We're not asking corporations and people who are the most wealthiest in our state or in our country to really pay their taxes at the same share and rate as low income people, but yet we're demanding low income people to make these really tough decisions that they don't have to make, like you had to make when you had your child and you were making that decision to leave the labor market, which is so hard. 3 children to leave the labor market. And I'll end on this, and don't get me started on the fact that women are still paid less on the dollar than men, and then it increases when you start to consider race, the gap. So we have a long way to go, but these are the conversations that need to happen, even when you're thinking about just the numbers and wonky stuff, like how does the economy recover from COVID-19?
Right. I think that the numbers have to walk hand in hand with the cultural paradigm. I think that it really, on the one hand, I could say, okay, well, the woman who told me, did I ask permission from the men? She was older. So I'm like, okay, well, she's going to be out of the picture soon. Right? But she had children. She was probably passing that on. And then she had maybe her church community or her other women in politics, or maybe a PAC group, right? That she was involved in. And then that's what they're saying. If that's what they're saying, then we're in trouble, So how do we make that cultural shift? Is, so have you heard of a book called Woke Racism?
I have.
Actually,
maybe I haven't, actually. I don't want to misspeak. I've heard of something similar.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
He's a linguist from the University of Columbia, I believe, in New York. And basically it was like, he even says, I wrote this for everybody, but I wrote this for white people, because there are some people that just decided that they were going to put on their superhero cape and sweep in, and it's very condescending. I mean,
to say the least.
Yeah. So how do we balance this? How do we say, okay, well, we don't want to be this, older woman perspective, but at the same time, we don't need saviors. So it's like finding that balance somewhere in there. There's a happy balance where you're empowering people, you're encouraging self-education, and and then making this cultural shift. It seems like this is something that is not going to happen in my lifetime. I can hope that can happen in my children's lifetime, but so I guess we are kind of in the business of planting seeds here, aren't we?
I believe that is 100% the case. I think some seeds have been watered already, right?
Yes.
People like you are in leadership, so the seeds have been watered in some way. I see this happening all across the country, where women and women of color in particular are starting to take back their power, take back their truth, and really hone into that. I will say that a lot of times it comes down to a few things, and two in particular: white dominant culture and internalized racism. And I'll talk a little bit about what white dominant culture is. it's really what this woman was doing for you, right? She was teaching you, because it is a cultural shift. She was teaching you the culture of white dominance. This is what the white male has said we're supposed to do, think, learn, however, right? And that means that we have to be on time. We have to ask permission from men. We have to do all of these things. And if we don't, we are not being what we were told to be, right? Essentially. Right. And as a result of that, there's quote unquote consequences, seen and unseen. Right? How do people put you in line? And that is what the dominant culture wants you to do is, hey, wait, Michelle, Cortney, you're moving out of line. I need to put you back in line. This is where your place is. And why is your place here is because I'm supposed to be at the very top, because that's where my place is. Yes. But in reality, we're all a human race, right? We're supposed to all be equal, and we're all supposed to be having our own path and our own light, right? One flower doesn't grow just because another flower is growing taller. And so I think that that is one piece of it. But then there's another piece that I want to talk about very briefly, which is internalized racism. And a lot of times it's not the white savior, it's not the white woman who is putting us in line, but it's the internalized racism of ourselves and the people who look like us. When I say us, I mean people of color who have bought into white dominant culture and try to put other people of color in line just as much as white people. And we do it to ourselves, right? And then people might call it things like imposter syndrome, or people might call it things of I don't know if you've been called this, but I definitely was called this in high school, the white girl, because I'm speaking articulate and in full speech, right? And this internalized racism, only thing it does is undermine you and your whole self. And all it does is re-up and give permission to white dominant culture. And if we can shift those two things, because it's not just the white people and the white old ladies who tell us the things, but sometimes it's ourselves, because we bought into white dominant culture. Why? Because we spent 13 years of learning this. And then probably after K-12 and early education, we continued on to be in places and jobs and other education institutions that preach white dominant culture to us. So how can you avoid it? How can the white old lady avoid it? How can the people who look like you avoid it? So I think that once we kind of unlearn to relearn our situation that we're in, which is to deconstruct all of that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Yeah, I think you're brilliant. I think that, you're really, you've broken your own, so many boundaries, it's just amazing. And yeah. And so you're really dipping into a lot of self-esteem issues. When you're talking to a group of people or an individual that has been putting themselves down and been put down, there's a lot of subtlety in this work, because I personally have known people. Oh, and by the way, I was mistaken for a white person. I still get mistaken for a white person, but a lot of times people couldn't figure out what I was. They knew it was something, there was something in there. So I would get called Mexican, Chinese, or this is my favorite, Pocahontas.
Oh, no. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Right. It didn't help that I had long, dark hair also at the time. So, but whatever. I don't know what I am now. I've been told so many things that, I'm just yeah, well, whatever. Okay. But that's, to that point, we do get told a lot about ourselves. So at some point, there's some little light in there that needs to push all of that away and say, I know who I am. Mm-hmm. Right. And you gotta trust that, like you were saying earlier, about there was a voice that was telling you go in this direction, and you have to trust that gut instinct. And it's not easy. And there's such an interesting dichotomy too with the perception of Black women, where yes, Black women do get pushed down, but then also Black women are known to be completely fierce and gorgeous and just rocking it, right? You know what I mean? Just total badasses.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, it can be very confusing and there's a lot of subtlety. So another thing that I was going to say about that is that there are a lot of these families that I have met that there's a lot of abuse that's in the families, you know? So trying to help somebody just find themselves is one thing, but then when they've got all of this, like if they were, you know, born into a family where there was like alcoholism, physical abuse, you know, violence, and how, you know, emerging from that and becoming somebody that turns out with, you know, multiple degrees or something like that, making a difference in the world. I mean, what a challenge, you know? So, yeah, there's a lot of subtleties and in the variety of numbers, you know, when you just look at it from that single dimension and then you open it up and wow, what a world.
Right.
You know?
I mean, I don't have that experience. I didn't have that lived experience, but people that we often look up to, from the Oprahs in the world to, I mean,
oh my gosh, Oprah has an incredible story.
Yes. I mean, you name it. It's so many people talk about their overcoming, but I think that what's important is that we have to be careful when we get back to the number situation about exceptionalism and the reality that far too many people live in, right? And there are going to be these one-offs and there are going to be these wins, but to your point, that's not who you see every day.
And I don't think that's the majority.
Yeah, right. You know? Exactly. And so how do we build a world and a society that talks to those people and help those people and create, you know, I like to use this word a lot because it's so important, an infrastructure, a foundation for those who are experiencing the most toughest lives that we could ever imagine, regardless of how they look, but especially when they're Black and brown, because we know that the world is already against them the day that they're born. And then have to be in this environment that is not by happen chance, by the way, right? The people who are hurt people. And how did they get hurt in the first place, right? It's because of job loss. It's because of not being able to pay for certain things. It's because, you know, they have a genetic mental illness that is just passed on from generation to generation that has not been treated because the lack of healthcare or the racist healthcare system that we live in. It's a gazillion reasons why, like incarceration and the cycle that has, because there's over policing in Black and brown neighborhoods. And so all these things that I named, by the way, are funded and regulated by government through taxes and budgets.
Yes.
And so when we take these big things and we zero into this one young person, boy, girl, whoever, that we see who we really just want to make a difference in their life, it's really hard to come with just one solution because we know that it really is a holistic approach. But I do think that having examples or even just a person in their life, whether that's you or someone else, to show them a little light, they'll get the larger light. I really do believe that.
That can be a personal challenge for sure. I think I'm going to work on that on my own. Absolutely. Because there are those people that I know that have come from those lived experiences and, you know, they're not making it out, you know? And so I do need to, it can be a real challenge, but, you know, with these government policies, this is not reinventing the wheel. I mean, when we look at Norway or, you know,
Finland.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we've got examples that we could follow if we wanted to. So, I mean, is there anything that you can see that's kind of holding this up in the United States government?
I mean, there's small things, right? Like, well, I should say small. Small, I shouldn't say small because this might require a lot of money and spending, but I will say there's things that I think people have had ideas about for many, many years. Reparations is one.
Yeah.
Germany gave reparations. We might have not learned that part in school, but it is true. And did they do a perfect job? No, but it was there.
Right.
You know, a lot of EU countries have, you know, guaranteed income or basic income. And I think that that's something that the US can aspire to and actually accomplish and do. There's no reason why a family can't go into a grocery store and meet and get their basic needs met when they go into that store, or have housing. There should not, in the most richest and wealthiest country in the entire world, we should not have people without homes, right? Or thinking about how they're going to pay their rent in the morning. Right. That should not be something that we think about. And yet we see people thriving, not to say that there isn't homelessness in some of these places that we're thinking of, but it's very little compared to us. I also think that their policies around better, you know, incarceration sentencing and just, you know, incarceration generally, we know that comes from deep root past of slavery and all sorts of things. But and free labor being an investment for both public and private sector, that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother day. But we know that places like Scotland and Norway and Finland and all these places, they don't incarcerate people to life. They don't sentence someone for life. They surely are not incarcerating tons and tons of people for drug abuse or alcohol abuse and all these different things. They're giving them treatment, right? They're giving them substance abuse treatment for these things. And so I think that's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. We talked about childcare. There should be universal childcare. And, you know, Black and brown and other people of color should be paid a lot of money to be a part of that childcare infrastructure, because we do it naturally anyway, right? We leave the workforce and go into childcare. And so that means that there's a whole group of people who, through their own skill set alone, you don't even need to really go to that much school to do it, because you're doing it already, to build up an infrastructure for something like a universal childcare. And so the sky is the limit. And we see this happening in other places, whether that be in the EU or in some parts of other countries in the world. The toughest part is, I think, do we have the will? Do we have the will to do these things? Because we're spending so much on defense. And the only thing that we're at war at is COVID right now. And maybe racism as a great second. So I think we have to ask ourselves, do we have the will to make the investments that we want to, in order to see the world or the life that we want for others and ourselves?
I think our country has a big problem with abuse of power also. I think maybe more so than some of these other countries. I think it was Norway where I was reading that they let mom and dad take 3 or 6 months off or something like that. And their job is still going to be waiting for them, you know, and the dad was saying something like, well, this is the most formative time in this young person's life, you know, so of course it's very important for me to be here also, you know, and, you know, dad's rights have come up. And that's become a thing, but more so in the United States, I think that we have an abuse of power situation. And I don't necessarily, it's entirely because of capitalism, because there's capitalism in other places as well. But for some reason, we cannot, you know, let go of our private jet or whatever, if we're a governor of somewhere, you know, or a senator, and, you know, and take that's couple $1,000 or tens of thousands of dollars and put it, you know, back into the state, or put it into a nonprofit organization that is working towards equality and equity, you know, and diversity, you know, and it's a well-known fact in nature that diversity equals strength.
Yes.
So for us to be holding anybody back, we are losing out, you know, for us to not share knowledge, you know, education, the vast amounts of information that we have, and the vast amounts of opportunity that the United States has to offer people, you know, of all genders, of races, ages, you know, we're losing because of that, you know? And if it's because one or two people or a group of people want to hoard power, it doesn't make any sense, you know? It just hurts all of us. So, yeah, I mean, do we have the will to not be as sociopathic as we have been? I think that might be a tougher question, you know, because I think that we would have the will to make it happen if we put our minds to it, because we're certainly strong enough and smart enough, you know. But for those few people that are out there that are dominating, you know, in that negative way, I mean, they're the ones that need to make the decision, because, you know, it's going to, in the end, help them also, you know. So yeah, not mentioning any Texas names.
I mean, I will if I need to. Because you're right. I couldn't have said it better. I could not have said it better. We will continue to have that small group of people have people die and freeze to death.
Yeah.
For something that they could have controlled.
Right.
That we know was there. And capitalism, yeah, it could have been a benefit or a symptom of that, but that is definitely not why. It is the will of a small group of people who decides whether or not we make this country better or worse. Will we make this state better or worse?
And we have to do it without them. I think that, you know, we just have to make the decision that we're going to do it without them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of misinformation that is always out there also. And I think that it's been feeding a part of the population. And I mean, so how do we, that's another thing. How do we deal with the misinformation that's out there?
That is a great question. And one that I actually ask myself very often, right? Like, you know, how people say, like, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah.
Because the reality is that communication, messaging, like it is just brilliant, right? The way that people can strategize communication through Facebook or through all types of cable news and radio.
It can be manipulated.
It is just so brilliant, to the point of what you just said, manipulation. And how do we combat something like that? We have to not be scared to battle with the devil, right? Like we cannot be scared to really take it up and kind of like question our laurels, right? Like a lot of times people will say, well, you know, you can't be in the same fight with them because if you do, like that's not your values, that's not your morals, but we got to figure something out. And so honestly, I don't have the perfect answer, but I do know that, yeah, it takes two to tango, but we cannot just sit here in silence. We can't be a bystander to misinformation. We cannot be here and allow our grandmothers and grandfathers and our Uncle Pete's get this information and transform their whole lives on the fact of we don't want to have an argument, on the fact of we're going to turn the other cheek and rise to the occasion. Yes, please do that. That is so important. We should never stoop down to a level that's so low we cannot get back up again. Right. And we need to strategize. We need to organize so that we can win. And that's why I really love organizers. And I know this is somewhat of a tangent, but how do we combat misinformation? Sometimes it's the people on the ground who can help us the most. It's not the wonky people like me or you who are crunching numbers every day. It's really the people who can talk to the people, because apparently whatever misinformation and communication is going on, they're getting to our people. Right. And the numbers are not getting to our people. The numbers are glazing their eyes and like going over their heads. Right. And so we got to figure it out. I don't have the perfect answer, but I really do hope anybody who's listening to this podcast today or someone out there in the universe figures it out, because we'll continue to lose the battle if we don't really get to the hearts and the minds, because the misinformation is doing us a huge disservice, and it really is undermining our collective well-being.
Sure. Right. Yeah. I think that, you know, so I've read that people were hired to do some of this spreading of misinformation, you know, that there were real groups. And I think that, you know, part of the reason why maybe the folks that are on the side of equity and diversity and empowerment didn't go there is because we probably just didn't think that anyone would do that,
Right.
I mean, it's just,
we just thought no one is going to listen to that stupidness, right?
Right. Yeah. And then to have a whole population buy into it all is, wow, it's startling. It's very startling. No research, just take it for face value. It's very interesting.
But I think, one of the things it has done well, the misinformation piece, and a lot of people, you'll pick this up through our relationship together. I give people benefit where benefit is due, regardless of the situation is, but they make people feel seen and heard. What is it about wonky folks? What is it about smart folks that don't make people who probably never felt seen or heard or smart feel that way? Because this information is doing that, and it's doing it well, and it is equipping them with all the lies, but making them feel very smart. And, that is something we as in people who care about misinformation and want to dismantle it, have to do better about. Like, we can have this whole conversation about, diversity is important, inclusion is important, and still make someone feel like they don't know what they're talking about, or that they don't matter, or their opinion is lesser than. And yet this misinformation is like, you see that, that, you're right. And I'm gonna tell you the 100 and a million lies about how right you are, and make them feel good about themselves. And I think that that's a part of it.
I think you're onto something there, because I believe that was a tactic for recruiting white supremacists way back in the day, for, American Nazis or neo-Nazis or whatever they're called. That was a tactic. Actually, another tactic was like a lot of they would pick up kind of kids off of the street and feed them. And I don't know if you ever saw that documentary called Wild Country or something like that. It was, so this is not anything that is new or isolated to one group of people. This is a tactic that has been used over and over again by quite a few people and cultures as well. So that particular one was some sort of a cult type thing, and they were in Oregon, and they ended up busing in a whole bunch of homeless people, feeding them and doing all of these things, and then those people, they got enough numbers to vote, and then that person, that became its own little city or something like that. Yeah. And eventually they ended up getting, a lot of bad things were news, and and then shut down. But it's what that's kind of a microcosm of that manipulating empowerment that you're talking about right now. And so it's really, I don't know. I think that there's probably when somebody hears something that is misinformation, if you're in an urban environment, you probably have a gut feeling. But if you're in a more rural environment and you're just getting it maybe from your church or something like that, it can be, you're thinking, well, this is a blanket, conversation that's happening with our community. And then that becomes the topic of that community. And so that can be a little bit more challenging. I really do feel like our legislators need to get out into the rural environments a little bit more.
Absolutely.
And show what good they're doing, one way, shape, or form, because they are the ones that need to feel empowered by the people that are trying to empower them.
Yep.
So yeah, these are difficult conversations to have. And I'm so glad that you're out there taking it on and making a difference, and really providing that lens, that the policymakers can see their numbers through. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And I hope everybody who's listening and watching also did too, because we have to do better. And I agree. Inclusive also means inclusive of rural folks too, right? And not just urban folks. And I think inclusive also means Right now my lens is specific through race and gender, but ableism and orientation and age, as we mentioned earlier, and all these other different things too. Like all of that matters, and that's how we can, I think, help people feel seen. If we start to think about what you just said, making sure all these people matter.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much, Cortney. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And if you have any, references that people can turn to if they want resources, then you can send it to me in a text, and I will absolutely include it in the post.
Awesome. Yes, I will do. Have plenty of people.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a great day.
Thanks again for listening to LoTech Tuesdays by LoTech Wild. The mission and vision of Valdez Adventure Alliance is based in nature therapy. The events and resources provided allow people to find the satisfaction of self-accomplishment through effort, of climbing, of riding bikes, of hiking, of trail building, of immersing in nature. Our objective is to be a resource for people to find deep happiness and healthy outlets for themselves. Thank you for those who sponsor Valdez Adventure Alliance. IMBA, the International Mountain Biking Association, Access Fund, the American Alpine Club. We'd also like to thank the City of Valdez, Alaska, the Fat Mermaid, Bike Flights, Camp, Alyeska Pipeline, CVEA Community Foundation, Sterling, Loa Boots, Raven, Alaska, Athletic Brewing, Best Western, Valdez Avalanche Center, and The Prospector. Some 2021 event sponsors we'd like to shout out to also are Tiger Tail, Nix Wax, and Mountain Equipment. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.